My name is Jane, and I'm on the board of directors at Jayu. Thanks for joining us today for our fourth Jayu Speaks event. We launched our first session last month at the CSI as another avenue to raise awareness about ongoing human rights issues. Ultimately, through the Jayu Speaks series, we want to provide an open forum for leaders and advocates of human rights to share their own stories as well as the stories of others. We want to create a dialogue within our community and continue to inspire action and change. This event today was made possible by our presenting sponsor, Humber College and the CSI, and by the Toronto Arts Council. A special thank goes out to TIFF for hosting this event and to all the dedicated volunteers that made this festival happen. Jayu is a non-for-profit funded by the generous donations by people like you, and we ask that you continue to donate through our Indiegogo campaign, which we've now reached 81% of our goal. So please visit www.jayu.ca/donate. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Rob Montz and Robin Blotnick. Rob is a Searle Fellow at Reason TV. He's directed a series of mini-documentaries with topics including the North Korean propaganda apparatus, South Africa's civil strife, and the regulatory battles of the car service Uber. Born in Los Angeles, Rob graduated magna cum laude from Brown University, where he majored in philosophy. He currently lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and his genius corgi, Bronson. You can find him and follow his updates on Twitter at Rob Montz. Robin is a 2013 Sundance Fellow and the co-director and editor of the Hand That Feeds, a new feature documentary that won audience awards at Full Frame Documentary Film Festival and Doc NYC. It was selected Best of Fest at AFI Docs and received jury prizes at the Sidewalk Film Festival and the Document Human Rights Film Festival. So please join me in welcoming Rob Nick to the stage.
Hi guys, I'm Rob Montz. I'm from Washington, D.C. We're going to take a look at this short documentary I made for Reason magazine about South Africa, a country that I have had a very profound emotional connection to, as I think anyone would who's concerned with the cause of social justice. Unfortunately, things have not been going quite as planned there. I wanted to talk about why I think specifically film is an extremely powerful medium for communicating these ideas. And then why is it that it's worthwhile for us to think about this particular craft and what it can do that alternative means of communicating these ideas can't do. Right? So in 1991, the American government created something called the 1033 program. It's a program in which the Defense Department gives for free excess battlefield equipment and military-grade guns and rifles and other equipment to local police officers throughout the United States. This program, which has been operating for about 20 years, kind of operates without any regard whatsoever to whether or not this battlefield-grade, SWAT team-ready weaponry is actually appropriate for the individual areas that it's being given to. So you have a situation now in my home country, the United States, where there's a town called Preston, Idaho, which has a population of 5,000 people. It has 6 full-time police officers. By anyone's account, their chief obligation is to maintain the peace at bingo games. And yet, thanks to the 1033 program, Preston, Idaho also has a mine-resistant armored vehicle. There's another small town in Michigan called Lake Angeles, has a population of 300 people, has less than 1 full-time police officer. Lake Angeles also has 13 assault rifles. So since 2009, over $18 billion worth of battlefield-grade military equipment has gone and been dispersed throughout the United States. And you're talking about weaponry like scopes, automatic shotguns, flak jackets being dispersed to cops all throughout the country. So police officers that have the ostensible purpose of keeping the peace instead look like an occupying army. They look like this. Can you guys do image one? These police officers look like they're from like a low-grade dystopian sci-fi film. And it's also not just bad optics, right? This military-grade equipment has not been coupled with military-grade training. So it leads to overly aggressive bad policing. So you have guys like this that look like they're about to invade the Bin Laden compound being sent to break up small-stakes poker games. Or the greatest evil, medical marijuana dispensaries. Guys that look like that. I say all that and all that background to say that this particular issue of the militarization of the American police force has long been a pet policy project of some of the kind of libertarian undergrounds that I operate within in the United States. But it mostly had been met with public apathy until this particular thing happened, this image happened. And I mean specifically this image. Some of you might recognize the surrounding event, which is the kind of social uprising and protests in Ferguson, Missouri, following the killing of an unarmed black 18-year-old by a white police officer. But I don't just mean the protests. I actually mean this individual image, which has kind of come to be the go-to hallmark photo of this event. And there's things that you might not know about it upon first glance, that in a world now that is flush with amateur photographers everywhere, where you have an extremely powerful camera in your pocket, this image is actually from a professional. It's from a 20-year deep industry veteran by the name of Scott Olson, who works at Getty Images. And that there's aspects of this that belie a certain craftsmanship. The way it's composed, the focus, the way it's framed, all of those aspects are part of the reason that it's extremely powerful. And it's powerful in a way that an essay or a blog post or, like an article in an academic journal is not, right? And we kind of know why, because it gives it an emotional texture. It gives it a narrative oomph. It's no longer, the militarization of the American police force is no longer a nebulous issue for kind of libertarian radicals to worry about. You're seeing instantaneously the real harm that's done by this policy, right? It's not just for wonks to care about. And I think that particular juxtaposition about how powerful this is versus how powerful many of the standard modes of communication about public policy are, that has drawn me to film. That I am someone who did a lot of training in analytical philosophy, and I was a very vigorous member of the debate team voluntarily as an undergrad, and that I think there was a period of time in which I fetishized purely rational, logical-based argumentation, that if somehow that was the premier way to try to communicate ideas. And my thinking has changed, not in the sense that I think that's not important, it's extremely important, like the tool of logic is this miraculous means by which humans with our 3 pounds of meat in our skulls can actually make sense of the world. But I'm increasingly realizing the power of storytelling and imagery and narrative first as a means of trying to communicate certain ideas about the world. Now, I think that particular insight, and I think that film itself is a particularly effective medium for that means of communication, because you have access to all of these irrational, craft-based, kind of numinous means of communicating with your fellow human. You have music, you have editing, you have color, that can hit you in a way before you start wanting to read about it in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. And that what film can do is say, before I throw stats out there with you, before I try to argue with you, I'm just going to first tell you a story. I'm going to tell you a very clean story, and after I've told you that story, then we can talk. And I think that has very particular applications in the politics of my country. Now, I'm slightly hesitant to play into whatever I imagine the Canadian caricature is of the U.S. government. I worry that you guys think our Congress is just like 500 Rob Fords, just sort of drunkenly stumbling around the legislature. challenging people to arm wrestling matches, but there is a very toxic kind of tribal partisanship that now infects U.S. politics and the way that we try to dialogue about issues of importance. And so most of the time, it does not matter what the issue is. The first thing that people want to do is form ranks, signal their tribal allegiances, and they're not interested whatsoever in the actual communication of information. It's not about that for them, right? It's about proving that you belong to the morally righteous and superior tribe. And my thinking is there a way in which well-crafted film, well-crafted stories can cut through that deeply held instinct that is so anathema to the actual communication of information? That really well-done films can ground issues in the human in ways that you can relate to regardless of your political affiliation, regardless of your sexuality, regardless of any other tribal affiliations. They can just speak to you as a fellow Homo sapien who's sort of wandering the earth and trying to figure things out. And if film can do that, it can open up an avenue by which people can actually talk about these issues in a fruitful way. That you can find film in a way that no other means of communication can give you real emotional common ground, right? If it's done well. So I'm still a novice in this. I'm still learning how to make videos, how to make film. And so now you guys are going to see my attempt to do this for the news magazine that I work for. And the hope is, the aspiration in this and in future work is to try to make these sort of complex, seemingly distant ideas very human and ultimately ground in the lived experience of like fellow human beings.
It's worse than the apartheid government.
Late last year, virtually every A-list political figure in the world descended on South Africa for the public memorial of Nelson Mandela. Mandela achieved an extraordinary amount during his turn on Earth. There were plenty of epic storylines and moral lessons to be drawn from his life. And yet, this was the news item that made worldwide headlines.
South African sign language interpreter accused of gesturing gibberish during the Nelson Mandela Memorial.
I'm suffering from schizophrenia.
Told the Associated Press he saw angels coming into the stadium, that he had violence in his past.
I will see like things like chasing me.
We tried to contact the company. We couldn't reach anyone. The owners seemed to have vanished.
The translator fiasco is not an isolated incident. It is the inevitable outgrowth of a deep rot at the heart of the country's government. Studying how the country got to this point provides some important lessons in the perils of political monopoly. First, a quick history lesson. While official racism in South Africa dates back to colonial times, the particularly brutal system of racial segregation known as apartheid was ushered in just after World War II. Nelson Mandela was a key leader in the anti-apartheid struggle. He was convicted on charges of crimes against the state in the 60s and imprisoned for 27 years. There is no celestial camp counselor to step in and make things right. And Mandela's life is a testament to the fact that we can do it on our own. When he assumed the presidency in 1994, he embedded radically inclusive humanism into the foundational legal blueprints of the freshly reborn South Africa.
South African Constitution has probably the most thoroughgoing protection of individual rights of any constitution in the world.
For each, the body, the mind, and the soul have been freed to fulfill themselves.
Political rights that even exceeds those found in the United States Constitution.
The only country in Africa, for example, in which gay marriage is legal.
Now, at this point, Mandela's party, the African National Congress, has an overwhelming majority in the South African government. In 1999, during the second ever national election since the fall of apartheid, the ANC takes 2/3 of the National Assembly. And the secession of the presidency amounts to an anointment, not an election.
De facto president of South Africa already is Thabo Mbeki.
He's extraordinarily intelligent.
It really is quite obscene that poor countries become net capital exporters to rich countries.
Extremely well educated.
You have to read, you have got to understand, you've got to analyze.
He has a taste for scotch.
So I'm saying there are certain things like this that are fundamental, which I think would be of general application.
In other words, a person very far away from the townships.
Possessing great intelligence often gives people in power the false sense that they can master any issue that comes before them. And in Mbeki's case, that hubris mixed with certain cultural insecurity abilities to inform public policy in the most toxic way imaginable.
Mbeki, a man with no medical training, raising doubts about whether HIV really does cause AIDS.
How does the virus cause a syndrome? It can't.
I think it would be a dereliction of duty to say, well, as far as health policy is concerned, we shall leave that matter to the doctors and the scientists.
The government refuses to supply HIV-positive pregnant women drugs which could save their babies.
That thousands of babies are being sacrificed every year, and you have a president who can be arrogantly dismissive.
Life expectancy in South Africa fell from 63 at the end of apartheid to 51 by the time Mbeki was resigned as president.
South African President Thabo Mbeki has been asked to resign. He interfered in a legal case involving his rival.
Because the ANC effectively runs a political monopoly, the party isn't punished for Mbeki's gross failures, which means the ANC is free to elevate to power a man who's even more reprehensible, a guy who'd previously been removed from office because of fraud charges related to a $5 billion weapons deal.
He's magnificently corrupt.
The government is spending 250 million rand to upgrade his own private residence.
People have made a lot of hullabaloo. Government insisted from the security point of view, they need to participate.
Do the gym, the guest rooms, the visitors center, the 31 new buildings, do these constitute security enhancements?
I think you must respect me. The leaders who are there are not there to rectify the mistake of the past. They are there to live a gold life.
Cronyism that is present within the ANC is extraordinary.
The ANC is redistributing this wealth amongst their leaders.
Don't have teachers. The teachers are going. Government is not even taking any action.
Anti-apartheid struggle icon Dr. Lampela Rampele has said that the education system today is worse than during apartheid.
She's right. I am not afraid to say she is right.
Only 30% of people who take the high school exit exam get a high enough score on it to even hope for admission to the least competitive university.
Unemployment under the ANC had skyrocketed. ANC inherited unemployment rate of about 15%. Today, we are talking about 40%, 40.
Gulf between white incomes and black incomes is greater now than it was in 1994.
Ordinary black South Africans do not see room for advancement. If you do not know someone who is in the party elite,
Zuma has said that he's confident that South Africans will continue to vote ANC until Jesus comes.
The ANC, because of its large electoral majority, feels invincible.
People are starting to have quite specific and quite disturbing views.
It's better to go to the old South Africa than the new South Africa.
We have regressed into every racist's dream.
Deep, deep disillusionment with the existing political class.
So put yourself in the position of a poor black South African. You've watched the epic toppling of apartheid and the ascension of the transcendent figure of Nelson Mandela, and with it, the promise of a new era. 20 years later, your material existence hasn't much improved at all. That beautiful promise has gone unfulfilled, and you're staring down a government that's dominated by a political party that is wholly unresponsive to your needs.
People who feel they are voiceless and excluded will riot.
Quite extraordinary backlash now against the South African state. 45 violent protests every day.
South Africa is an incredibly angry country. People are barricading streets and burning stuff and help their stuff. About corruption, about the fact that they're being promised this and it's never happened.
When I see my brothers taking a stone throwing at the policeman, I'm going to help it because they don't help us.
What's happened to the rainbow nation now? That seems to be dissipating right in front of them.
Think about it. Black South Africans are now rioting against the party of Nelson Mandela. And as their frustration grows, they're willing to turn to anyone who might offer them the hope of genuine renewal.
There is a new political party, the Economic Freedom Fighters. led by this young firebrand, Julius Malema.
Go and cook in the kitchen if you are not for revolution.
People really blew them off as way too far left.
Want nationalization, expropriation of land without compensation. If you are not prepared to share, then you are your own enemy.
But they're really gaining steam really fast.
You are failing to match my thinking capacity.
Stand on our way, we crush you. Revolution is about pain.
Where has expropriation of land without compensation worked?
No, it doesn't mean if it doesn't work anywhere, it can't work here.
Throw out reconciliation, let's throw out the Constitution, is to fundamentally abandon Mandela's legacies.
Malcolm X spoke about house Negroes. You know, house Negroes are black people who identify with the oppressors, and you speak like a house Negro.
Greatly pains me to think that South Africa, that we can't actually learn the lessons of history. What went wrong in the rest of Africa, and how do we avoid that? Neighboring countries have been completely destroyed by bizarre socialistic governments. Zimbabwe, the dictator of Zimbabwe, the guys provided us with pauperization of the nation. It was like a massive intended violence and barbarity, and it's like ruined the lives of millions and millions of Zimbabweans to the extent they're not going to recover for decades if ever. Julius Malema is likely to be that way.
And Zimbabweans so far are doing very good.
And if we fall into that future, from wherever in the world I will then find myself, I will always be able to say, South Africans were warned years in advance. And being a free and open society like we are today, it will be harsh but true to say, South Africans brought this fate upon themselves, and they ended up with the government they deserved.
Please join me in welcoming them. So Rob, you've now covered topics related to North Korea and as well as Uber. What caught your attention about South Africa?
I just think, and I only glanced at it for this. There's just, think of your favorite movie, and the way that whatever that transcendent sense of fulfillment that whatever character goes through. I mean, whatever it might be, that actually happened in real life in South Africa in a way that it just hasn't really ever happened in human history, as far as the toppling of an evil empire and the resistance being led by this person who is so astonishing in his moral fiber and his vision and his intellect, Nelson Mandela, that it's difficult to believe that he's even human, that he's also composed of the same stuff that we are. And that, toppling of the apartheid regime, it came with such hope. And I went there a couple of years ago, and there's so much, it takes your breath away, and then to see it be systemically corrupted and undermined for extremely petty reasons is very disconcerting. It's extremely disconcerting, particularly on the continent of Africa, in which South Africa is the exception as far as its ability to function successfully. So that's what I was trying to capture in this, just this sense of lost potential.
And a similar question to you, Robin. Without giving too much away about your film, The Hand That Feeds, you focus on the exploitation of undocumented workers living in New York. Can you tell me what inspired you to cover this issue?
Sure. Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks to Rob for sharing that film and for sharing this panel with me. My film, The Hand That Feeds, was a project that evolved out of my directing partner, Rachel Lears, and I were covering Occupy Wall Street. And at the end of that movement, after the evictions from the park, there was sort of this, there was this depressing kind of moment where people felt like everything was falling apart. And there was this one group that was starting to do things that people were talking about, reaching out to immigrant workers and kind of getting involved in concrete local struggles where there was potential for actual victory. And when we started going to their meetings, we met the workers of this particular restaurant chain called Hot and Crusty. which is in a very wealthy neighborhood, the Upper East Side of New York. And these workers were undocumented immigrants, mostly from Mexico, who were willing to team up with Occupy Wall Street and talk about taking these very unusual radical actions like occupying their workplace. And we just thought it sounded like something really exciting and interesting was going to happen. So we started following them around.
And a question for both of you. After covering such issues, how has this changed, I guess, your perspective on the world or human rights in the different areas that you've explored?
I've talked a lot.
Well, you know, I think it's really interesting to be at a human rights festival with this film, and I really appreciate the festival bringing the film here. We were hoping that human rights festivals would show the film because it's such a we think of human rights as always being these really big, epic, you know, atrocities, mass graves, and political prisoners, and all of that is, you know, obviously front and center. But there's also human rights at play in the more mundane, day-to-day lives that we live in developed countries as well. And to think that the people who serve you coffee in the morning might be having their human rights violated in some small way that really matters is really it changed my perspective on what human rights actually is. And I think the process that I witnessed in The Hand That Feeds of ordinary people with very little power taking it upon themselves to change their lives in very meaningful ways without a whole lot of outside help was really inspiring. And it really it makes me feel like anything is actually possible. It gives me hope. And I hope the film does that for others too.
Yeah, I think I have somewhat, which is that there basically are stories everywhere because there's humans everywhere, but it requires a certain level of like Zen-like. You have to open up your antennas to it, because I know at least for me, the vast majority of my interactions, I'm not with human beings. You're not fully appreciating. It's like they are also operating from a equally separate portal of the way that they're appreciating the world, and more often than not, it's difficult not to fall into the habit of seeing them as a means to an end, or not sort of fully appreciating who they are, or not putting this particularly eloquently. But all of it's to say that because everyone has this unbelievable subjective lived experience of the world, that means there's stories everywhere of basically infinite varieties. The key thing you have to do is just be sensitive and conscious of them. And then you can, if your antennas are out, you can pick this stuff up anywhere under any circumstances.
And another question addressed to both of you. Like Rob, in making the film about South Africa and doing the research for it, were there any surprises, something you didn't know that really shocked you? And then same for you, Robin, throughout the duration of the film and meeting these different people involved, what was the most shocking for you, or something that you learned that you didn't know before?
Yeah, I think, well, the struggle is always that really good films need to have very clear emotional through lines. You have to at least try, and you try to tell these particular stories. But in so doing, you also don't want to ignore the unnecessary, like the necessary messy complexities of life as it's actually lived. And trying to find that balance is certainly something that I try to work on. And specifically for this one, I don't think I quite did it, but when you're like me and you just idolize Nelson Mandela it's like, I mean, I basically don't get to complain about anything ever again because of what he was able to go through and still come out this profound moral visionary. But there's also ample evidence, once you dig into it, that indicates that he actually, during his only term of presidency, unfortunately, accidentally laid the foundations for the corruption and the devolution that was to come, in allowing a certain level of casual cronyism to exist, in being willing to establish these inalterable political legacies that make people less responsive to the voting public. There are very key specific decisions that he made during his presidency that enabled those tumors to form. And there just wasn't room to cover it here, but it certainly surprises you. And I think inevitably, if you're doing your job, you should be regularly bumping into inconvenient nuances and complexities of the universe, because it's unfortunately doesn't fit into nice, neat parables.
Yeah, for me, I think besides witnessing the sort of story unfold before my eyes, and there's a lot of really surprising, shocking twists that hopefully if you come tomorrow you'll see. I think that the most shocking thing for me was realizing my own connection to the material, because I think, like Rob talks about, I mean, you have to have a very personal, emotional connection to what you're covering to do the work, put in the sacrifice of making a film at all. And I think I'm always, with any project I do, I'm always surprised when I learn sort of later on, midway into maybe post-production, just why I made the film. In this case, I realized that this was a film about people developing their own, developing a political consciousness, and sort of overcoming cynicism and fatalism, and that was exactly what I had kind of gone through in the process of finding this story, and also about finding a voice and kind of going from a more shy person to a more public person. These are very personal ways that the characters of the movie connected to me, and I think that's kind of the most meaningful thing, when you realize that the story you're telling was actually sort of about yourself in some small way, even if it's totally different.
And I'll have one more question before I open up to the audience. And this can be for both of you as well. I think it was a personal question, because in, I think, a largely democratic era where democracies are, I guess, more prevalent than ever in history, and we have a large commitment to individual human rights. What do you think what are some of the root causes you think that we still see an exploitation of immigrant workers in the U.S. or the major corruption of government in South Africa? Like, in your opinion, what do you think some of the root problems are?
Yeah. So I actually don't see it, I don't conceptualize it as problems to be weeded out. It's more that I see functioning democracies, peaceful democracies like Canada, as minor miracles that are to a certain extent in like direct violation to a lot of natural impulses that humans want to engage in. I mean, we saw last night this incredible film about these guys that leave Canada to go help topple Gaddafi in Libya. And it's a very, very depressing contrast between the moral clarity of knocking down just one of the all-time assholes of humanity, and what happens in the aftermath, which is you have to build a functioning government. And you see it in the film. It's extremely difficult to do, and from what I can tell, with like very briefly dabbling in the literature, by that I mean I've like read 4 tweets, is that no one really knows how it works, like how you can kickstart something to the point that it's a peaceful democracy. So for my thing is, part of what animates, at least what I'm trying to do, to put it in the unfortunately most grandiose terms possible, is that the more that I come into contact with these other failed countries, the more I appreciate what we've got here. And part of what animates me is to try to get people to appreciate what they've got, but also the recognition that I think this is anomalous in the 200,000 years or so that humans have been on Earth. This is the exception to the rule. Yeah, that was a very long-winded answer. That was not really an answer.
Yeah, for me, I tend to see a lot of problems as having economic roots, and I'm very sort of oriented toward economic justice issues. I feel like in the U.S. that it's not just about undocumented immigrants. Service sector workers everywhere are working for very low wages that often don't keep up with the cost of living in the cities where they work. And we saw with our film, as soon as these workers concluded their campaign, I won't give too much away, there was the fast food strikes began in New York City and then spread across the country, and now they're sort of spreading to other parts of the world, even around an issue that I think is just very common in the developed world of the only jobs available for a lot of people are really crappy service sector jobs. So those kinds of issues I feel like often they're the underpinnings behind the good, peaceful democracies that we live in that are creating unrest, that are creating instability, and I hope that my film kind of shows some of the ways that people can push back against these forces and really change things for the better.
Thanks, guys. I'll now open it up to the audience, and if you have a question, just put up your hand and a mic runner will bring a mic over to you.
I was just curious about how you two as Americans feel and felt about the Obama presidency, particularly because that was a big moment in your country's history, and also left you with maybe not the same level of hope as the South Africans felt when Mandela took power, but it was a big moment for progressives in the United States, and I'm curious as to how you feel the last 8 years have gone, or I guess 6 years to this point, and whether it's left you hopeful, whether it's left you angry. How do you feel?
Feel free to tap on that one.
Sure. That's a good question. Yeah, I remember I was in Brooklyn, New York, when Obama was elected, and after so long under Bush, I think there was this real sort of explosion of joy. People were out in the streets. Women were taking their shirts off. People were smoking weed openly in front of the police. It was this really amazing moment where everyone sort of felt like a revolution had occurred and everything was different now. And I was caught up in a lot of that. I think there was just a general feeling of like, you know, anything but what we had before. And also Obama's speaking he's one of the best speakers I've ever heard. And I think he captured a lot of the hopes of the people who voted him in. I felt very quickly disappointed. I felt, you know, with the 2008 bailouts that were happening and Obama surrounding himself with J.P. Morgan high-ups, there was immediately this sort of signals being sent that things were not totally changing in all the ways I would have wanted to see it change. And then the continuation of you know, Guantanamo, drones, there began, I think a lot of people began to feel very dark and cynical that things weren't changing enough. And when expectations are high, but results are not coming in, people get really upset. And I think that Occupy Wall Street was very much a manifestation of a lot of young people feeling like they had sort of been tricked. Their hopes have been gotten up, and now they're dashed, and that sent a lot of people out into the streets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Occupy is a good example in what I was talking about before. The Tea Party movement and Occupy Wall Street actually have like a huge amount of overlap in their correct diagnosis of what's wrong with a lot of the federal government, which is the co-option of key levers of legislation by well-connected, wealthy corporations. But they rarely communicated about that idea because I think for both sides, maybe particularly the Tea Party side, a lot of it wasn't. They kind of had to define themselves in opposition to the unhygienic hippies in downtown New York City or whatever, right? I do think that that's an extremely important problem. I also am very skeptical of, if not actively critical of, any sort of savior making of political figures, because I think it can turn toxic very easily, and I also think that it's an incorrect conception of how genuine reform goes about. It's less about individual messiah figures, at least in the current American political milieu, than it is about kind of larger structural changes. And the final thing I will say, as part of my somewhat incoherent response, is I think, regardless of your political persuasion, let's say this. I think that initially, even people that voted for Obama in 2008, which I was one of them, initially were saying the reason why he has not fulfilled his promise is because of deep structural problems, including an intransigent GOP minority than majority. I think that was true for the time, but now there's a shift in the narrative where people also think that he's just not particularly good at the job, people of multiple political persuasions. And I don't think it's because of intellect. I think he's an extremely smart guy. I think it's because being president is actually a job. And in the same way that you want to have a lot of professional experience before you get a top-notch job like that, he would have benefited from more experience in that some particular role of being an executive in some capacity. At the same time, it's very difficult, if you are that person, to play yourself off as the outsider, because that means you've been serving in government for a while. So it's a difficult catch-22. But I just think that the American presidency is I've seen logs of his day. It's astonishing he doesn't have a heart attack constantly. And insofar as it is potential to master that position, it just requires a lot of skill. You need to be in politics for a long time. So
I'd like to add also that I mean, this has been said by many people, but a lot of the backlash really angry backlash to Obama has a racial tinge to it, and I feel like that hampers him in many ways from talking about a lot of issues that we really need to talk about. He's made some great speeches on race, but lately with the issues around Ferguson and other things, I think a lot of people are disappointed by his sort of reluctance to take a firm stand on those issues.
Went wrong with the Mandela campaign that kind of set up this the corruption to happen with this new government. Like, what do you think went wrong in your opinion?
Well, I think justifiably so. The ANC had a very powerful spiritual sway on the South African population because they've been doing this anti-apartheid work for decades. And so when they came into power, they were essentially, maybe justifiably, immune from criticism. And Mandela operated within that system, and he appointed people in various key staff positions, including anointing Mbeki as his successor, not out of merit, but out of how deeply they had been committed to the ANC cause, right? I think that's part of the problem. I think also he was 72 at the time. Prison had physically worn him down, and there's a difference between being an excellent technocratic manager and establishing, key social institutions for future flourishing, and being a figure of immense inspiration. And I think those are just two different skill sets. He could have had a second term if he wanted one, and he didn't. And I think that was instructive, both because of a recognition of his own limits and also just maybe to a certain extent a disillusionment with the actual process by which the ANC was then controlling. Yeah. But it's when you get to the point where people are both economically marginalized and they have no viable means of political voice, which is effectively the situation for large populations of the black underclass in South Africa, I understand why reactionaryism and radical economic solutions and kind of forced redistribution of wealth becomes appealing. I might think the same way if I'd been born into a township. And it's just a very scary situation. The most recent election, the economic freedom fighters, I think, won 5 to 6% of basically the lower chamber of the legislature. So not like a takeover. It's not going to be Zimbabwe tomorrow. But we've seen that if these low-level pressures are allowed to kind of continue to fester for too long, there suddenly can be radical paradigm-shifting changes. And it always ends horribly in Africa when that happens. Yeah.
I'm wondering if both of you could just speak a bit more about your filmmaking process, seeing as both, Rob, I'm assuming you're not a black man who lives in South Africa, and
accurate.
I'm hoping you're not an undocumented immigrant.
I don't trust her.
How kind of, as an outsider, you give the voice back to people in the film. If you could kind of talk about that a bit, and maybe the takeaway for both of you that you're hoping the audiences get from these films.
Oh, that's a great question. With my current film, my previous films were a little more in a film essay kind of style. It's similar to the piece we just saw, which is a style I really love. And I think it's really great to be able to give your personal take on things and use archival footage and also do extensive research and tie a whole bunch of different thinkers together. With my current film, it's much more of a character-based story, kind of verite documentary, and we didn't use any interviews with anyone who wasn't directly involved in the story. We really made a very serious effort to tell the story from the point of view of the workers, not the organizers and activists who come in, not anyone else, but the workers. Partly because they were the most appealing characters, they were the most charismatic, and they were the easiest to trust. Our test audiences had a much harder time with the Occupy Wall Street kids or the labor organizers who were involved. But also because we felt a very serious ethical obligation to give them their voice. And my directing partner, Rachel, is also an anthropologist, so she had a very serious training in sort of the the ethics of representation and that sort of thing. I think that during the editing process, we realized that certain scenes weren't working simply because there wasn't a character narrating it and grounding it from their own perspective, a worker, and that sort of became our it became our way of getting around a lot of really tricky scenes. We would find a way to just sort of set it up. This is how it looks from their perspective. This is why this person's important. Why they want them to come in and help. And I think I had hoped that the result is it feels like a movie that really does give voice to people who might not otherwise have a voice. We do have to be humble in those situations.
Yeah, I don't actually know. I mean, like, literally every potential facet under which I could be privileged, I was born into it. So but the issues that naturally I'm attracted to are people that were not born into said privilege. I think, I mean, for me, that particular tension, at least at one point during the editing process, causes me to loathe myself and my decision to do this for a living. And I hope that's for the best, maybe, but I don't actually know if I have an answer, and I'm like extremely open to critiques of anything that I do that I'm missing some angle because of my limited perspective on something. And I don't really know what to do other than to show it to people that have come from different backgrounds, that are emotionally invested in it, that are coming from a place of good faith, and then actually listen to them if they have critiques. That's the way to do it.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Rob and Robin, for coming in and speaking with us today. We are actually screening The Hand That Feeds tomorrow at 5:45 p.m. here at the Tifbell Lightbox, so please come join us, and Robin will be with us again and he'll be in another Q&A session. And as well, after this, there will be another screening for Polytechnique, and we're commemorating the 25th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre, and in doing so, we'll be donating 50% of our proceeds to a battered women's shelter in Montreal, so please join us for that. And please thank Rob and Robin for joining us today.
Thanks, Rob.